So thank you everyone for being in this last session of our Metametaphysics seminar. Today it's our honor and privilege to welcome Professor Giusepinna, who is soon to be emeritus at Keele, if I remember correctly, and is a guest researcher at the University of Oulu. So if you've been there yesterday, she's a specialist of Collingwood, and she's there to talk to us about presuppositional analysis and the goal of metaphysical inquiry. So thank you again very much for being there, and the floor is yours. You have 1 hour for presentation.
Okay, well, thank you very much, first of all, to invite me here. And so this is a little bit like a continuation of yesterday, I suppose. And what I'm trying to do is to present, in very broad strokes or brushes, Collingwood's philosophy, and in particular to see how his philosophy of history is underpinned by certain metaphilosophical assumptions. So what I'm beginning what I'll do first is to introduce his conception of metaphysics, which is not a traditional conception of metaphysics. And after that, I will try to show how that informs his defense of the autonomy of historical understanding, by which he means a certain kind of humanistic understanding of the past. And then I will return again to his conception of metaphysics after that discussion. So sometimes philosophers claim that the task of metaphysics, they think of metaphysics as having a particular task, which is to say to tell us about what the fundamental constituents of reality are. Yeah? So in that respect, you could say that they look at reality a little bit like a cake, which is baked out of certain ingredients like eggs, flowers, butter, and sugar. And it is the eggs, the flour, and the butter, and the sugar that, if you like, really exist, and which account for the appearance of the cake as being sweet, as being moist, and so on and so forth. Now, this is the conception of metaphysics that Collingwood does not have. So he does not think that the task of philosophy or of metaphysics is to do that. If that were the task of metaphysics, then philosophy would enter into conflict with science, because science too, especially physics, sees itself as telling us what the fundamental properties of fundamental constituents of reality are. So if this were the case, then philosophy would enter in conflict with science. But that conception of metaphysics is very much like what is at stake in, say, contemporary debates between physicalists and panpsychists. Physicalists say reality, fundamental constituent of reality are physical. The panpsychists say no, they cannot be, because otherwise you would not be able to account for the fact of consciousness. And in order to avoid what they call the hard problem of consciousness, you have to assume that somehow the fundamental constituencies are already imbued with consciousness. So this is, I suppose, the conception of metaphysics that he doesn't want to endorse, and he doesn't want to endorse it because he thinks that, as I said, it puts philosophy in conflict with science. And if it doesn't put philosophy in conflict with science, what tends to happen is that in order to avoid that conflict, then philosophers take on the role of the underlaborers of science. So they delegate the task of coming to know the fundamental constituents of reality, normally to physics, and then they are there in a kind of subsidiary position. If philosophy takes over that role, then normally what happens is that it also creates a conflict between forms of knowledge, because once you assume that there is one science which, or explanations, captures what really exists, then that science enters into conflict with other sciences. So physics can enter into conflict with chemistry, biology, and so on and so forth. So this is not something that he says explicitly, but I think it's an implication of the conception of philosophy, of metaphysics, that he wants to reject. So how does he want to think of the task of philosophy? So according to Collingwood, knowledge is not something that philosophy gives you. So he thinks that if you want knowledge, you should go to a physicist, to a chemist, to a biologist, to a historian, and so on and so forth. If you want knowledge, that's where you will find it. What philosophy gives you is something else, which is the understanding of the presuppositions on which knowledge in these different forms of inquiry is produced. Yeah, those are the laboratory of knowledge, not philosophy. So the way in which he thinks of the task of philosophy is by thinking of knowledge, the knowledge that is created in the sciences, as a kind of very intricately woven pattern, woven out of different colored threads. Yeah. So whenever we make knowledge claims, there are different kinds of inferences and different kinds of explanations that we use, and very often these explanations intersect in kind of imperceptible ways. Yeah. But nonetheless, the threads have different colors. And he thinks that that's what the task of philosophy is. It is to sort of tease out the different colored threads to show that they're doing something different, they're drawing different kind of inferences. And we do use this kind of inferences in different, we shift imperceptibly from one to the other. So sometimes I use the example of when my daughter was younger. Sometimes, I said to her, look, you should pick up the wet towels from the bathroom floors, yeah? Now, when I tell her something like that, I treat her like as an agent who can respond to certain norms of civility, yeah? On the other hand, sometimes, kind of 2 minutes later, I said to my partners, don't bother say anything about banging the door, yeah, because it is a hormones. So, we shift from one kind of explanations where we treat a person as a kind of, natural being and treating, on the other hand, as somebody that responds to norms. So this is what I'm trying to illustrate here is the ways in which these threads are intertwined. Or, for example, if you think about, when you watch a crime drama on television, there are the detectives who are trying to find out who committed the murder, yeah? And they enlist the help of forensic scientists, yeah, who can assist them in their task. So the forensic scientists, will analyze the grit in the fingernails of the victim, and then they will say that particular stuff that was found under the fingernail comes from a particular area of the country where the person who was thought to be guilty could not have been at the time of the murder, and therefore they will rule out the suspect. Now, the forensic scientist and the detective are engaging in Collingwood would say, in different complexes of questions and answers. So the detective wants to find out who had motive to kill, who was the murderer, yeah, wants to solve the murder mystery, whereas the forensic scientist is using completely different methods, is answering different kind of questions about what is the material composition of the stuff that was found in the fingernail, in which regions of the country it is found, and so on. So they're asking different kind of questions and using different ways of finding out what they need to find out, but they support each other. And Collingwood uses a nautical analogy to illustrate what it is that philosophy does. And he says that in a way to try and sort of tease apart the different colored threads is a little bit like disentangling a net that the fisherman has brought out from the sea, and it's all in a mess, and it's trying to disentangle it. Now here is an example of disentanglement that he gives in an essay on metaphysics. And the ways in which we apparently use the same word because to provide an explanation, but we are actually providing very different kinds of explanations. So he gives the example of somebody whose car breaks down, and they wonder, why is it that my car broke down? And then there is a passerby that comes by, and the passerby happens to be a theoretical physicist, and they tell him, look, your car broke down because the top of the hill is further removed from the bottom of the hill, and it takes more power for the car to go uphill. And then a second person comes along. It's an AA. Probably we don't have the AA in Belgium, so it's a car mechanic. What is the
like the roadside help?
The
people.
roadside help people. So they come along, and this person comes along and says, "Look, your car stopped," and then he finds a mechanical failure. Now, Collingwood wants to say that the person who has answered the question is the car mechanic, not because the explanation of the physicist is false, but because it doesn't answer the question that the person whose car broke down wanted to have answered. What he had in mind is, how is it that I can fix my car so that I can get home? What he wants to say is that there are two different senses of explanation. He speaks of different senses of causation that are at work here. There is an unconditional sense of causation, which is the one that the physicist uses, where whatever happens, whether the causes of an event is unconditional. And then there is another sense of cause, what he calls cause in sense two, which is at work in what he calls the practical sciences of nature, things like engineering and, for example, medicine, where the cause is, he says, an event by producing or preventing which you can produce or prevent that whose cause it is said to be. Which is to say, in the practical sciences of nature, the cause is a handle, it's like a switch that you can manipulate in order to achieve a particular goal. And the car mechanic operates with the second sense of causation, and that is why the explanation that is provided by the car mechanic invokes this manipulability account of causation, and it is why it is using this handle account of causation that it is answering the question of the person who is standing by the roadside. Now, what Collingwood is saying is not that the explanation of the car mechanic is true and the explanation of the physicist is false. He is not saying that. He is saying that the explanation of the car mechanic answers the question that the person lying on the side of the road wants to be answered. Now, when is the philosopher needed, according to Collingwood? Now, it is not needed in order to find out how to fix your car. So if you want to know whether your car broke down because it ran out of petrol, because it had a flat battery, or because it has a loose cable or whatever, you don't call in a philosopher. And if you are dissatisfied with the explanation that the car mechanic gives, you just take your car to a different garage. You don't consult a philosopher. But you do need, on the other hand, the philosopher when you find situations in which you have, what I was mentioning, that kind of crisscrossing of forms of inferences and knowledge. And it looks like that there is a problem because there are certain questions that could be answered by providing different kind of explanations that appear to come in conflict with one another. And that is when the philosopher is needed, in a sense, to make us think about which is the appropriate kind of explanation that should be given. So he says that there are different senses of causation, and that the term cause has different meanings in different explanatory contexts according to what it is, what are the goals of the form of inquiry one is engaged with, what it is that one is trying to find out. And he distinguished very broadly between what he calls the theoretical sciences of nature, of which physics is an example, where a cause is unconditional, the practical sciences of nature, where engineering and medicine and car mechanics belong, where the cause is more like a handle, and the sense of causation that is at work in what he calls history, by which he means humanistic inquiries. And he thinks, so he thought that history, a certain kind of history, is where you can look at to kind of try and tease out what this distinctive sense of causation or explanation that is used in humanistic context is. So he says that in the sense of explanation or the concept of causation that is used in a humanistic context is still different from the one that you find either in the practical or in the theoretical sciences of nature, because in this humanistic context, a cause is a motive. And the example that he gives is that we find this sense of causation used in sentences such as, he had cause for concern, yeah? Where you mean he had reason to be concerned. Where cause means something quite different from the heavy rain caused the river to burst its banks. So, according to Collingwood, because what we are entering the realm of reasons, humanistic explanations show you the point of what happens, not what normally happens when certain antecedent conditions occur, but rather the point of it happening. So, for example, you might wonder, why is it? So imagine that you were some kind of Martian anthropologist who was hovering over St. Peter's Square at the time in which the cardinals were gathered in conclave to elect a new pope. And you might realize that the crowds cheered when white smoke appeared. Yeah? Now the question is, you could try and provide a nomological explanation and say, well, that is what normally happens when white smoke cheers. Assuming that you could actually do that, because very often in the past the smoke was black, but assuming that you could actually single out that event as the relevant event from everything else which was going on, which is probably quite difficult, but assuming that you could, you still would not have explained why, in the sense that would be important to a humanistic historian and to the Martian, if he were a kind of cultural anthropologist, why the crowd cheered. Nor would you be able to explain that by using simply a counterfactual explanation, because you could say, well, had the smoke not been white, the crowds would not have cheered. But still, that doesn't explain you what goes on in St. Peter's Square. So if you want to know what goes on in St. Peter's Square, then you have to understand what Collingwood would call, in a sentence that has been hugely misunderstood, the context of thought, which is to say, you have to know about the Catholic Church, you have to know about the significance of the Pope as a spiritual leader of the Catholic Church, and also about the norms which govern the communication of the election of the Pope to the crowds. When you do that, then you do understand what is going on in the sense that is relevant to, I suppose, a humanistically oriented historian. So what is it that the philosopher does? The philosopher is looking at these different forms of knowledge and then saying, when in these different forms of knowledge, the practitioners of those forms of knowledge provide explanations. What kind of questions are they answering? And what are the presuppositions which give rise to the question that their explanations are an answer to? So what is it that, for example, an historian, and again, in this context, it does, a humanistic historian, so when I say historian, read humanistic historian in this context, what is it that in the context of a humanistic explanation we presuppose when we provide explanations? What sense of explanation is at work? So what he does is a kind of logical detective work which consists in ascending from propositional answers to questions, explanations understood as becausal answer to why questions, the questions to which share an answer, and the presuppositions which gave rise to the question. Now, what is the presupposition when you try to when an historian, in this sense, tries to understand Well, is that there is some reason, yeah, why the people acted as they did. So the philosopher in this respect is a little bit like a detective, which is looking for logical clues. And his view is that you can reconstruct the questions and the presuppositions from the answers, because whatever, you know, if you take a statement like, okay, there is a bottle on the table, it could not be an answer to where are my socks, yeah. So there is a relationship of entailment, not strict logical entailment, but there's a relation of entailment so that you can ascend from the answer to the question, and then also and from there to the presupposition that gave rise to the question. In the way in which you could see that that when the person at the side of the road was asking for a causal explanation, they were looking for a handle. Yeah, you can ascend from propositional answers to questions to the presuppositions that gave answer to them. So the task of the philosopher in this respect is to look at these different complexes of questions and answers and to disentangle them from one another. It begins from the assumptions that explanations are causal answers to why questions. It acknowledges that the concept of cause shifts meaning in different explanatory contexts, and then the task of presuppositional analysis is to align the right kind of answers to the right kind of question. So the answer of the physicist is the wrong answer to the question, how do I fix my car? Not because it's false, yeah, but because it doesn't address the concern of the person who is asking the question. So if you read Collingwood like this, then what it means is that presuppositional analysis supports a form of explanatory pluralism. And what I mean by explanatory pluralism is the view that the choice of an explanation, Collingwood speaks of senses of causation, depends on the context of inquiry and one's explanatory goal. Now, and this claim, so the reason why I'm saying this is because Collingwood is often not read in this way. So the sort of standard reading of Collingwood, which unfortunately is still current, is that his metaphysics understands he understands the task of metaphysics as the task of understanding what people believe. But he's not doing that because he is not interested in what doctors believe or in what physicists believe. He is looking at the presuppositions which are constitutive of their form of inquiry and which entail the questions to which, the kind of questions to which they seek answers. So if one reads Collingwood like this, as promoting a form of explanatory pluralism that disentangles different complexes of question and answers according to the explanatory goals of different forms of inquiry, then what he's doing when he is saying, don't misunderstand the question of, don't answer the question at the side of the road by providing sort of the explanation that a physicist would give, is something which is much closer to what Aristotle says when he says that, in the Nicomachean Ethics, that you shouldn't expect as much precision in the discussion of human affairs and in morality than you should expect in mathematics. So he should say it is that kind of claim that he is making. So that what he is defending is a form of explanatory pluralism, not a form of relativism. Because the ways in which relativism is normally understood is as the claim that what one believes is relative to this person or this group of people at this time, at this place. But that is not what is Collingwood is saying. He's saying that knowledge is relative to the explanatory goals of a science. So, and I think that these two senses of relativity are often confused, and there is a difference between a presuppositions being axiological to a form of inquiry and it being believed. And he is quite clear that to presuppose something is not the same as believing it. Now, okay, I will get to why presupposing something is not the same as believing it in a second. But if you read Collingwood this way, then of course you see that different forms of knowledge do not compete, because answers to questions can compete only if they are answering the same question. But if they're not answering the same question, then they're not in competition with one another. So the answer of the car mechanic does not compete with the answer of the physicist, because although apparently they are asking the same questions, why did the car stop? They are in fact answering two very different questions. So if you read him this way, then his goal is not to promote a form of historical relativism, but rather to undermine a form of scientism, according to which it is possible to have presuppositions as knowledge, or according to which there is one form of knowledge that actually requires no presuppositions. So this is how, I suppose, this is, I think, what Collingwood is doing when this is what his metaphysics is doing. And why, if you read his metaphysics like that, then you can understand his philosophy of history as providing an argument about the autonomy of historical understanding. So the general contrast that he wants to draw, I think, is not between knowledge that is time-bound and knowledge that is not time-bound, but between knowledge that is based on presuppositions and knowledge that is not based on presupposition. And his claim is that knowledge that is not based on presuppositions is in fact chimerical, that there is no such thing. And so he claims, for example, in the Metaphysics, that there is no such thing as a science of pure being, and that's why he sees himself as doing what he calls metaphysics without ontology. Now, oh dear, I know you gave me an hour, so I've probably squished too much into it, but if it becomes too long, I'll just stop. Now, I said that presupposing and believing are different things for Collingwood. Although there are, I suppose, historicist claims in metaphysics, like you can always read philosophers in different ways, and that there are some claims that have a relativist flavors. I wouldn't want to deny that. He does explicitly claim that to presuppose something and to believe it are not the same things. So to believe something is to believe it to be true. It would be very odd for you to say, I believe it, but I know it's not true. But you can presuppose something without believing it to be true. And very often, I think, on Christmas morning, we ask the kids, what is it that Santa brought you? Or you could have the tooth fairy. What is it that the tooth fairy... Did you have the tooth fairy in Belgium?
Yes.
Yeah? Okay.
Yeah. Little mouse.
Yeah.
Little mouse.
The little... Mouse. That you've got the little mouse. What is it that the little mouse brought you? Yeah? But nobody believes that the little mouse... When they ask that question, they don't believe that the little mouse exists or that Santa exists, but they presuppose it. So there is a distinction between believing something and presupposing it, and presuppositions do their work not in virtue of being believed, but in virtue of being presupposed. So they do their work because they are constitutive of the forms of inquiry which make possible. So what does it mean for them to be constitutive of forms of inquiry? I guess I read you here a quote from Collingwood. He says, the question whether the effect can be produced or prevented by producing or preventing the cause, this is the Handel conception of causation that is at work in the practical sciences of nature, is not a further question which arises for persons practically interested when a proposition that, for example, malaria is due to mosquito bite has been established. It is a question which has already been answered in the affirmative by the establishment of that proposition. This affirmative answer is in fact what the proposition means. So if you're saying malaria is the bite of a mosquito, you're engaged in a form of inquiry which is concerned, which is medicine, and finding out how is it that you might prevent somebody from developing malaria. Yeah? So that is what you mean already when you're talking about cause. This affirmative answer is in fact what the proposition means. In other words, medicine, the science to which the proposition belongs, is not a theoretical science which may on occasion be applied to the solution of practical problems. It is a practical science. The causal proposition which it establishes are not propositions which may or may not be found applicable in practice, but whose truth is independent of such applicability. They are propositions whose applicability is their meaning. So when a doctor says, you got a migraine because you didn't drink enough water, that's what they mean by because. Yeah? They don't mean because in the ways in which it would be used in a context where the cause could not manipulate it. Drink more water and you will not develop migraines. Yeah? Now, for Collingwood, to disentangle these senses of causation or these different explanations is to be clear about what one's explanandum is, which is to say what it is that one tries to explain. So what he would say is that if you deploy the sense of causation that is at work in the humanistic disciplines, where you are dealing with the domain of reasons, then your explanandum is an action. Yeah? So when one explains the crowds cheering in St. Peter's Square by saying they cheered because of the election of a new pope in the context of the Catholic faith and so on, one has explained that as an action. By contrast, if you deploy a different form of explanation, then you would not be explaining it as an action. So this is not to say that there aren't different ways in which one could explain what the crowds in St. Peter's Square are doing. Perhaps you could explain them a little bit, like in the ways in which an ornithologist explains the swarms of birds flying around in the sky. Yeah, you could do that. But if you did that, then you would not be explaining it as an action. You would be explaining it as something else, so your explanandum would be different. So actions in this sense, or the sense in which Collingwood is using the term actions, which he takes to be the subject matter or the explanandum of humanistic inquiry, are not a class of things, nor are they a subclass of events. Yeah? They're more like a technical term that describes the ways in which we can explain what happens. Now, this is why I think, as far as Collingwood is concerned, there is a sense in which scientific explanations could never explain humanistic actions understood in a humanistic sense, because scientifically you can only explain events. So that in some ways, and vice versa, so humanistically you cannot explain events. And in some ways, if one form of inquiry tries to do that, then they incur the curse of King Midas, whereby, King Midas was a king where, everything that he touched turned into gold. So that if you use the kind of explanations that you're using in the biological sciences applied to human organisms, then you're not, then your explanandum is not an historical agent. It's a human agent, but not an historical agent. And what you're doing is not explaining an action. Now, what I want to do is to see how Collingwood applies this to history, and how this conception of metaphysics informs his defense of history as a humanistic discipline. Now, the past for Collingwood is an ambiguous expression. It can mean very different ways. So the past to a cosmologist, the past to a geologist, the past to an evolutionary biologist means something quite different from the past as it means to the historian of Roman Britain or to the historian of ancient Egypt, and so on and so forth. So, for instance, he says that yes, there is a certain analogy between the archaeologist's interpretation of stratified site and a geologist's interpretations of rock horizons with their associated fossils, but the difference is no less clear than the similarity. The archaeologist's use of his stratified relics depends on his conceiving them as artifacts serving human purposes and thus expressing a particular way in which men have thought of their own life. Now here Collingwood is thinking of archaeology not as a scientific archaeology, but as a kind of more human, as asking kind of humanistic questions. And you could think of, suppose, building in a city, you know, and you can, you know, the stratified, like there is a city in Italy, Lucca, where they built a medieval town. In the Middle Ages, they built houses on top of the remains of a Roman amphitheater. Yeah. Now, of course, you could say, well, you know, you could look at that in terms of a timeline, but the kind of timeline that is being used in a kind of humanistic context of explanation is quite different from the timeline that is used in a kind of geological context of explanations. You look at architectural styles and so on and so forth. In fact, you know, the houses could have been built out of the stones taken from the amphitheater, so they could be, you know, they could be dating to the same time in which they, well, whatever. So the historical past, what Collingwood wants to say, is understood in the past as a kind of historical past understood as a humanistic past is understood in a very distinctive way. So you could excavate something and find something like that, yeah. And you could carbon date it and so on and find when it dates to. But on the other hand, you could describe it in a different way as a fragment of a pot. Now, the moment you're describing it as a fragment of a pot, you have brought it under a humanistic explanation, because you're now describing it as an artifact which had a particular function within a particular practice, such as that of carrying grains or liquids from one place to the other. Now, forensic archaeologists can probably help you to understand a little bit, because if the fragment was porous, then it would be proper to infer that it was not a pot that was used to carry wine, because it was porous. But you cannot even describe it as a fragment of a pot of whatever description simply by carbon dating it. The moment in which you've described it as even as a broken artifact, yeah, as a fragment of the artifact, you've already brought it under a humanistic description. The same you could do with, I suppose, imagine that one found on the bottom, on the riverbed, some planks that had been burned to cinder, and then one, established that they belonged to a funerary ship. Yeah, it's very different to kind of date the wood, maybe telling how it, when it burned, but to do that is quite different from understanding that as an element of a funerary ship, because then you're understanding it as an artifact that has a role in a particular practice. So forensic archaeologists and history do entwine, and they do help each other, but they answer different questions. So these are pictures from the excavations of the remains of Richard III in a car park in Leicester. And, the forensic archaeologists did the excavations, and, and there were, if they hadn't had historical records telling them that, he had been likely to have been buried there, then they might have at best, I suppose, been able to say that it was a certain species of hominid that died so many years ago, but they wouldn't have been able to identify him as Richard III. So these forms of explanations do intertwine, but the forensic archaeologist is not interested whether Richard III was really evil, yeah, whether it was him who kind of killed his nephews because he wanted to remain in power and so on and so forth. So knowledge of the natural past and knowledge of past from a humanistic perspective is very different. So I used this example yesterday, so apologies for repeating it to those who were here, but this is to try and illustrate that the historical past and the natural past rest on different presuppositions. So some time ago, the remains of the Denisovan girl were discovered in the cave that then was called the Denisovan cave, and what they found was a piece of bone which was about 2.5 centimeters long, and it was the kind of intersection of the phalanges of the kind of last finger. And on the basis of that, they managed to establish that the girl died when the time of them was approximately when she was an adolescent. And the way in which they did it is that they know that the phalanges in the finger fuse at a particular it's a process that takes place at a particular period in the life of humans, namely when they become adolescent. And because they were not completely fused, they thought that that's when, that they dated the time, the age she was when she died. And in order to do that, they had to look at living humans and when the epiphyseal fusion, as it's called, occurs. So in order to infer that she died when she was an adolescent, they had to presuppose that nature is uniform, that the future resembles the past, or that the past resembles the present, because otherwise they would not have been able to draw the inference on the basis of one sample. Now this is quite different to what goes on in humanistic history. Do they have Doctor Who in Belgium? Yeah? So Doctor Who is this Time Lord that travels in time, so he travels both to distant galaxies, but also in the historical past. And what I'm trying to illustrate here is that humanistic history cannot rely on the presuppositions of the uniformity of nature, or on the idea that the future resembles the past, or that the present resembles the past in the way in which a certain kind of scientific history can. So if you travel back to the times of Rosa Parks in 1950s Alabama, then you cannot assume that if you're a black person, you will be able to take a seat on a bus, or that So if you want to understand from a humanistic point of view why what Rosa Parks did was so significant, after all, she just refused to give up her seat to somebody, it's because in order to understand that, you have to understand it in the context of segregation, the segregation laws that govern the movement of people in the city. So you cannot make the same presupposition. So you can presuppose that if you go back to the times of Rosa Parks and you bring with a bottle of water and the temperature drops below 0 Celsius, then the water will freeze. But what you cannot presuppose is that you can actually find the same expectations apply. So there is a distinction between the historical past, in the sense of the humanistic past, and a kind of naturalistic past. And this distinction is not the same as the distinction between the recent past of humans and the distant past, the distant geological past, or the past of planet Earth, and so on and so forth. So I'm saying this because I do disagree with what historians such as Dipesh Chakrabarti claim. So in a way, such historians are saying to people, to standard historians, to more kind of traditional historians, you have been very parochial. You just looked at this kind of history of humans. You should expand your horizons, and you should you should go much deeper in history. And then you can go into deep history, or you can do big history, as somebody like David Christian does, who thinks that he can that history goes from the history of asteroids to that of the mobile phones, so that you got all these things in the same bag. from cellular phones to asteroids. Now, the humanistic past is not the same as the recent past. It is the past understood in a different way. So you understand the bone remains of Richard III, which is in the relatively recent past, in a way that is possibly not very dissimilar from the way in which one might investigate the fossilized remain of the Neanderthal man or of the Denisovan girl. I think there are differences, but what I'm trying to say here is that it is a mistake to say that to do a certain kind of history is to be parochial. And of course, there is a great deal to be learned from the intersections of the sort of longer term history. There's lots of things that we have learned about the ways in which humans have caused, and the anthropogenic conditions have caused climate change, even back in history. So there are lots of things to be learned from that, very much in the way in which detectives can learn from forensic scientists and historians from archaeologists. But nonetheless, the kind of complexes of questions and answers are different. So the relevant difference is not between the relatively recent past of Richard III, who died in 1485, and the very distant past of the Denisovan girl, that died between 60 and 80,000 years ago, but between, on the other hand, a past that considers agents as engaging in practices and understands what they do in relationship to those practices, and history which, on the other hand, proceeds in a different way. This is not to say that it is not history, but that it is a different kind of history that is concerned with a different sense of the past. So the past, in that sense, the term past needs to be disambiguated, much as the term cause needs to be disambiguated. So, as I said, there is a lot of helpful crisscrossing between humanistic and scientific history, but I won't go into it anymore. But what is clear is that these different senses of the past go hand in hand with different epistemologies of historical knowledge. In fact, they command a different epistemology of historical knowledge. So if you think about something like the Rosetta Stone, there are lots of questions that you can probably ask about, geologically, about the stone. It was made of black granodiorite, however you pronounce it, and you can ask what kind of rock it was. It was a volcanic rock, and so on and so forth. So. But on the other hand, that is not how an ancient Egyptologist, that is not why an ancient Egyptologist is interested in the Rosetta Stone. It is interested in the semantic context of the inscriptions on the Rosetta Stone. And the reason why it is so important is because it contained the same text in different languages, which meant that it opened way, in a way, to understanding as far as I understand, gave a much better understanding of the Egyptian hieroglyphics. But these are different things, yeah? So, you cannot read the semantic context of what is in the Rosetta Stone. You cannot infer it, yeah, from its volcanic composition, just as you cannot infer from from the chemical composition of the fragment of a pot, that it was the fragment of a pot. Now, there are people these days who speak of baseball being made of molecules arranged baseball-wise. I don't think you can't really speak like that. It would be like saying, oh, yes, we can infer that it was the fragment of a pot because the molecules that make up the pot were arranged fragment of pot-wise. But to me, that sounds like, nonsense. Yeah. So the point here is that you cannot really move from one form of knowledge, just as you cannot infer the beauty of a statue from the composition of the stone out of which it is carved. Yeah. You cannot really move from a scientific to a humanistic explanation. You've got to begin somewhere else. You've got to begin by making different presuppositions. Now, all this has a number of metaphilosophical implications for how to think about non-reductivism. And the kind of explanatory pluralism that Collingwood defends is very different from the form of non-reductivism that tend to be on offer. Because, at least in the philosophy of mind, and I'm less familiar with the philosophy of science, and I do know that I need to do more work in it. So in the philosophy of mind, most contemporary forms of non-reductivism are such that they accept certain naturalistic assumptions about the notion of explanation, and then they see, I suppose, they see explanations in the other sciences either as competing with explanations at the basic level, or they try to say that those other explanations supervene upon the explanations which are given at the very basic level. But as I've tried to show, historical explanations do not supervene upon scientific explanations, because you cannot explain the fragment of the pot or the plank of the funerary ship as qua plank of the funerary ship, or qua fragment of a pot, by carbon dating it or understanding its chemical compositions. Those are just different kinds of enterprises, which are both useful and important, but different. So, in a way, what he shows is that there is really no problem of explanatory of causal exclusion. That problem, in a way, has its roots in a particular hierarchical model of the sciences, according to which there is one fundamental sciences upon which the others supervene. But it's not just saying I reject this model. He's giving us some reasons as to why we should reject that model. And the reasons that he gives us to reject models is that he shows that you cannot answer the questions that are posed by a historian by adopting the methods that is used either in geology or physics. And likewise, you cannot answer the questions that are asked by a geologist or a physicist by using, on the other hand, the kind of techniques of a humanistic historian. So his claim is that this problem of causal exclusion does not arise. But what he's doing is not saying that only humanistic history is proper history. I mean, sometimes I think he's taken as doing that. I think what he is saying really is that humanistic history is a distinctive kind of history. So he wouldn't want to say that only historians working in history departments in universities are allowed to investigate the past. He's not saying that. He's saying, but what he's saying, on the other hand, the past that they are concerned with is not the same past in which a cosmologist is concerned. So it makes sense, perhaps, to have a cosmologist in the Faculty of Natural Sciences as opposed to in the Faculty of Arts and Humanities. So he is not saying that one form of explanation is real and the other is not real. He is saying that the question as to which explanation is real is the wrong question to ask. Now, it's good practice not to go on for too long, I'm told. So I could stop here. Or maybe I'll say very, very quickly why they're not real. And then
We started a bit later.
yeah, okay. So if we go back to the metaphysics, so what is he saying? Is he saying what is the task of philosophical analysis? Is to understand the presuppositions that give rise to the questions which are answered in different contexts of inquiries. These presuppositions are taken for granted by the practitioners as forms of inquiry. Yeah? So doctors don't really question whether causes are handles. Yeah? They may not even think about it. But on the other hand, if somebody asks them to justify why they're using a cause in that way, they would say, well, we just don't do that. Yeah? Now, probably for a philosopher that's not quite enough. Yeah? But what Collingwood often says is that absolute presuppositions, the fundamental assumptions that govern forms of inquiry, are not truth apt, in the sense that you cannot find them to be true or false in the ways in which you can find the answer to the question, did my car stop because it had a loose cable, because it had a flat battery, or because it ran out of petrol, to be true or false. So those presuppositions are of a different nature, and you cannot ask which one of them is true of an inquiry-independent reality. There is no such thing, because questions arise only given that certain presuppositions are being made, and beyond that there can be no questions. I suppose a science of pure being would be to try and find a form of knowledge that answers no question in particular. But you will find out that if you have no question in particular, then you will not know how to go about finding your answers. I'm going to go a little bit more quickly here, but this is not to say that he thinks that, they're animalistic, that, we just accept this upon instinct, yeah? But that they are constitutive of the form of inquiry. So you cannot really, if you practice medicine, say, well, I am not going to treat causes in that way. And if you do, there's a kind of hypocrisy, yeah, because you're helping yourself to the very things that enables you to be making the claim that you make. So in terms, if you think of this, this probably deserves a paper on its own, and I cannot do it, but just very briefly, if you think of this absolute presuppositions as kind of hinge propositions, as they are sometimes described in the context of hinge epistemology, Collingwood takes a very different view of these hinges from Hume. So take something like the principle of the uniformity of nature, which underpins our entire generalizations, yeah? Hume would say we cannot justify it, therefore we just believe it, yeah? Because nature is too strong, yeah? So we just believe it. We've got no reasons to believe it, yeah? Collingwood is saying something different. Is saying that skeptical doubts concerning absolute presuppositions are idle because they're not really genuine. You cannot doubt the Handel conception of causation as you're engaging in the practice of medicine, or as you are, say, an engineer trying to build the dam that diverts the course of water. You have to presuppose you can change the course of nature. So, while you might think that these doubts are genuine doubts, yes, epistemic doubts about the fundamental assumptions, like the inductive principle, the deductive principles, the principle of the uniformity of nature, are genuine doubt. We can raise them, but they're idle. I think Collingwood thinks that they're idle because they're not genuine doubt. So the doctor can really genuinely doubt the Handel conception of causation. So, just to conclude, he gives us a very different picture of the relationship between philosophy and science. As philosophy does not advance any first-order knowledge claims, then it does not claim any things about the nature of the universe, the circulation of the blood, the atomic composition of gold, and so on, or the motives of Caesar's crossing of the Rubicon. It does not compete either with physics or geology or cosmology or biology or chemistry and so on and so forth, because its task is not the pursuit of knowledge, but the understanding of the presuppositions on which knowledge rests. So what he does is, in a way, is to say that the natural sciences are sciences in a different sense in the same sense in which history is a science. Yeah, they are a form of knowledge with their distinctive presuppositions and ways of coming to know the world. And so he denies that, if you like, certain natural sciences have an epistemically privileged role. Yeah, without, however, turning philosophy into the underlabor of science. So he avoids the conflict with science in a different way. Okay. All right, I think I've managed. Thank you.
breaks for you to have a coffee and some water.
Some water.
you ready to start again?
Yeah.
Okay. So, many thanks again for this very clear talk. So I open the floor for discussion. If someone has questions, please go on. Questions? Wow. It was a very clear talk. You have a question? Okay. So, well, I have questions, so I will start. Somebody has questions. You have one, Mita?
Not yet.
Okay, so I will start. So, one thing that struck me, and it was the same yesterday, but it's even more obvious to me right now, is that the way Collingwood talks about the presupposition, the knowledge that's always presupposition full, but there is always like an inquiry that we have to settle in to settle the questions. It seems very much like a Dewey kind of setting, like a Dewey kind of thinking. I was wondering if there is some relationship between Dewey and Collingwood at some point, because it seems so much the same kind of metaphysical ideas. When you had this quote from Collingwood from 1940, I think, their proposition with applicability is their meaning.
Mm-hmm.
Seems like very much the kind of thing that you would find in pragmatist tradition. And so I wonder if there is some historical links between both.
Not that I'm aware of. So I guess I don't know, and I can see that there are certain pragmatist themes, but I also think that Collingwood, I think there was a kind of slightly stronger Kantian influence on him. But so basically, I don't know. But it's worth exploring, and there are people who are exploring it. There is an article by Eleanor Popper. I don't know whether you've come across her. I can dig it out for you if you remind me. She does explore the relationship between Collingwood and pragmatism. So I think that there is work to be done there.
Yeah. In the reverse, because you're saying that there's probably more Kantian influence in Collingwood, but in one of the recent historians of pragmatism that I like a lot is he has made his whole career trying to show that Dewey is in the transcendental and in the Kantian tradition. He's trying to put more explicit Kantianism behind
right.
Dewey's
So
doing.
who does this?
Sami Pilstrom, who is in
Oh,
Finland.
right, yes. Okay.
And so when I read his version of Dewey, and Collingwood was very much like in line with one another. So.
Yeah, yes. So I suppose it's just that I'm not as familiar with the pragmatist tradition, but I think that there are pragmatist themes. I also think that, as with everything, the devil is always in the detail, and I think that, Collingwood wouldn't say that, the true is the way of, who says that? Never mind. I think his position is that, and I don't know, what the connections are, but is that it doesn't really. So you have true and false statements. Yeah, historians do make true and false statements. Scientists make true and false statements. But what you cannot say that has truth value are the presuppositions which enables those truth statements. And I think he thinks that it is a mistake to ask whether they are true or false. So I don't know whether in the pragmatist tradition there is that view. Maybe Carnap, the sort of Carnap of semantics, empiricism, and ontology, as you could think of it, external question. Questions about absolute presuppositions are a little bit about external questions, and external questions are nonsense questions, something like that. I think it's
You're right, because the idea of truth as a means to an end would mean that presuppositions are true if they are as the right presupposition for the aim that you're trying to make. So in this sense, I suppose there are differences there.
Yeah. So, but I think that he would, and I'm just speaking about the Carnap of that essay, not the earlier Carnap.
Yeah.
But I think there are some the view that they are not true or false is has some similarities there. Or perhaps with Wittgenstein's hinge propositions. There are differences as well, but yeah, I think that's where I would take it if I were to push the comparisons.
Which is interesting because it makes it far less as an anti-analytic or or something entirely else than mathematical tradition, because there seems to be like common threads somewhere. So
Yeah.
usually it's presented as an anti-analytic philosopher or something.
Collingwood.
Yeah. I've heard that at least.
Right. Okay.
But, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I always thought of him as being I wouldn't call him an analytical philosopher who speaks in plain English, but he has some continental themes. But then unlike continental philosophers, he doesn't have a lot of technical terminology. So this is not to say that he doesn't use words in a technical sense, because actions and events they are technical terms really, but it does if you think about Heidegger and the amount of technical, it doesn't have that. Yeah. So in some sense, in terms of the broader themes, you could think about the neo-Kantians, Rickert and Lindemann defending Newton. So I think that he is more aligned with those kinds of themes than with the analytic tradition. But on the other hand, I suppose the ways in which he writes, he doesn't write like I suppose an analytic philosopher writes these days, but it doesn't have a lot of technical terminology.
That's clear. Thanks. Other questions?
Yes, no, it's just a general question. Could we understand this conception of history as science as an answer to logical positivism?
So he saw himself, he did see himself as, so Metametaphysics was a reply to Ayer's Language, Truth and Logic. So Language, Truth and Logic was published in 1936 and Metaphysics was published in 1940. And, Ayer had said, look, propositions which are not empirically verifiable are meaningless unless they are tautologies. They are the verification of principles. And Collingwood tried to show that there are some claims which are not empirically verifiable, nor are they tautologies, but yet they are meaningful. So, that causes are events by preventing or producing which you can prevent or produce that was caused to be, are conceptual truths, you could say, they are conceptual claims, about the meaning of causality, but they're not meaningless because, they underpin a way of coming to know the world, but they're not empirically verifiable either. So, in a way, what he did think about Ayer is that Ayer, I sort of didn't quite go as much into this here, but, Collingwood's critique of Ayer would have been that he has failed to distinguish between propositions or propositional answers to questions and presuppositions, and that in fact the principle of verifiability is, if you like, a kind of presupposition of natural science. It's like that you put forward claims which are empirically verifiable, which is not in itself verifiable, so that so that's the sort of criticism that is often made of Ayer. But Collingwood's criticism would be that he failed to see the distinction between a proposition and a presuppositions.
Yeah, thanks very much. Yeah, I have a question about your talk. For me, it's very similar to the perspective realism. So I just wondering the difference between your presupposition and between the difference between presupposition and the perspective.
Perspective.
Yeah. That's my question.
Right. Okay. So. I think perspective is probably a little bit broader than, I mean, maybe sometimes I might have even used them interchangeably, but I think perspective is probably a little bit broader. So I think that presuppositions in the ways in which he thinks of them, and I think underpin methods of discovery in that sense, because they, if you presuppose the principle of the uniformity of nature, or if you presuppose a particular conception of causation, that tells you how is it that you're then going to find out certain truths by making those presuppositions. So I think that in a sense they are narrower than perspectives, because you can speak about the perspective of the ancient Egyptians, you can speak about the perspective of the pre-Copernicans, and in some sense those are presuppositions, but they're kind of historically based. Whereas I think that in the context of metaphysics is not really looking at certain presuppositions which are also fundamental beliefs, is looking at they kind of underpin ways of discovering truths about the world, so that if you if you are trying to find out how is it understanding agents, which in a way that is what humanistic history does for him, then in a way you're presupposing that they're responsive to reasons, and that sort of open up ways in which you can, you try to make sense of them, which is to say, by rationalizing them, So in that sense, I think that the distinction there is that perspective is much broader than presuppositions, and that presuppositions you can, maybe they have something in common. I don't want to say they don't have anything in common, but in the context of the essence of metaphysics, I would say that he is concerned with the distinction between humanistic and scientific inquiry as methods of discovery, as forms of inquiry. And I don't think that perspective has got quite that tinge. So they have something in common, but in some ways you can speak about the perspective of the geologist, or the perspective. Yeah, you can speak like that, but you can also. I don't think I think he thinks of them as way of coming to know things about the world, as underpinning the kind of questions that then, by answering which, you find truths about the world.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, sure.
Thanks a lot for your talk. It was very interesting. So this might be a bit too technical as a question. I was wondering whether these presuppositions are supposed to have similar grammar as propositions. I mean, they don't have truth values, but could they have truth values? I mean, are they, or do we have to see them more as kind of rules or something like that, or methods or something? That it's in principle even wrong to give them a truth value.
Mm-hmm.
Are these things that could have been truth values, that could have been verifiable and so on, but just don't happen to have that purpose in a knowledge system?
So I think that what he is saying is that as long as they are constitutive, or as long as they are working as presuppositions, they cannot have truth values. So that, it's like I suppose that you could be a humanistic historian who also has as a hobby, practice some, sort of is interested in physics, and, or in some sort of, and then you go home and you would be, as a physicist, you would be assuming, you would take on different presuppositions. And then from that perspective, you could say, of course, everything that happens no matter what. But they cannot have truth values insofar as they are operating as presuppositions.
Right.
So in a way, you could think of them as rules in that sense.
But I guess my question is more linguistic. Do you recognize a statement as being not a proposition, or do we have to look at how it's used? Whether it's a presupposition or a proposition.
Yeah. So
because a rule in principle, you could find out whether it's some call for action or something like that, just grammatically speaking, often. While other statements, I mean, if you say that it's out of context, you think that they should have a truth value, but then you might find out that it's been used by this historian or philosopher or whatever as a presupposition.
Yeah. So I think that's right. He would say that, you know, whether they are a presuppositions or a proposition, it depends on the role that they play in the logical question and answer. So one way of trying to explain it would be to say, so it's not so much what they state, but the role that they play. So, you know, if you think about the game of football, for example, you could say that, you know, you can have a role in that play. You can be an attacker or a defender, yeah? And then you could, you know, a player could be either an attacker or could it be put in the role of defense or in the or in the role of attack. And I think similarly, statements can have that dual role. Yeah, so they can function either as presupposition, this is what it would say, if they give rise to questions, or as propositions, if they answer to questions. But it does say that absolute presuppositions, so the fundamental assumptions which govern forms of inquiry, are never really answers to questions. So in that sense, they are not really ever intended as propositional answers to questions. So he doesn't think that the statement, a cause is an event by preventing or producing which you can prevent or produce what is cause said to be, that is ever an answer to a question. He thinks that is something that gives rise to the kind of questions that then are answered by some forms of knowledge. But there are, I don't know, another example maybe. I mean, you could say that, something like the sun revolves around the earth. Okay, so, you know, people believe that. And it was also an important presupposition that people made, yeah? But it's different from that which enables you, you know, the method by which you find out whether the sun revolves around the earth or not. So there are certain presuppositions which, if you like, are more fundamental than others. I'm thinking, you know, about Wittgenstein's no man has ever been to the moon. You know, before the moon landing, that was a little bit like, I suppose, the sun revolves around the world. You know, people didn't really, you know, that it made no sense to question them. But nonetheless, they're different from something that enables you to find out truth. And I think that, you know, in terms of the ones that he discusses in an essay metaphysics, you know, the different senses of causation and so on, those are, and they cannot quite double up in that ways, you know. So how is it that you falsify the conception of causation that, you know, a Handel conception of causation? You can ultimately falsify that no man has ever been to the moon or that the sun revolves around the earth. But those propositions are not, you know, they're fundamental assumptions that and to some extent they do function as norms as well, but they're not methods of discoveries in the ways in which the sort of absolute presuppositions that he discusses are. I think he has, you know, something a little bit more fundamental at work, the principles that govern, you know, our rationality.
Yeah, makes a lot of sense. Could I have a floor? Sure. So it reminds me a little bit of discussions about the role of definitions and axioms in mathematics. So an axiom in principle is just a sentence like any other. I mean, there's nothing special about an axiom, grammatically speaking. That's what an axiom is. It's very special. It's something that is an ordinary proposition, but it's like put forward as this is what is the foundation of this system. While a stipulative definition is always a rule. It's from now on, it ought to be, it has to be used like that, right? So then if you look at axioms, there seems to be some doubt, is this a rule or not? Because it is not just a proposition, it is like what defines the system. But then there seems to be a difference between the sentence itself, the axiom, and this sentence is an axiom, the longer sentence, and that would be a rule. So declaring something to be an axiom is another statement from the axiom itself.
Right.
And so I was wondering, this makes me think like maybe these presuppositions are really just propositions, except that you add to it and I presuppose them sort of implicitly.
Huh.
Like as you say, well, this is a sentence, but I add to it, from now this defines my system. You see the connection I'm trying to make?
So hopefully I can, hopefully I may be, I don't know, we'll see whether this answers the question. So I think, I don't think you can sort of, it's voluntaristic that you can say, well, I'm going to decide in that sense, because in a way,
Sure.
yeah, okay, so that wasn't.
But also in math, this is the case.
Okay,
right? I mean,
all right.
You cannot
Yeah.
just as a
Yeah,
mathematician
okay,
all of a sudden
yeah.
start evaluating
Yeah, okay,
actions.
okay. So Collingwood says this, he says that metaphysicians, in his sense of the word, never propound a proposition, never propound absolute presuppositions. They always propound the propositions that such and such absolute presupposition is made. Yeah? So there is a sense in which, in his view, the metaphysician doesn't propound the absolute presuppositions as a proposition. Yeah? But he says historians are So what I am telling you is the proposition that I'm making is that historian presuppose this. Yeah. Does that answer the question?
Yeah. That clarifies a lot. Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
So in a way, they don't propound absolute presuppositions as propositions, because if they did, then they would think that they have truth values.
Yeah.
What they are saying is that is what historians presuppose. This is what is presupposed here. This is what is presupposed in this other form of knowledge. But they're not saying propounding that. That is not to propound them as propositions. Is to say that they are presupposed. So, I think if I get the quote, it was towards the end, and I've rushed the last bit. I'm not just saying, it's because it's the bit that I didn't do that. If I had done the last bit, everything would have been revealed. He says, if I can find a quote. So the philosopher does not propound the proposition, there are causes, say in the interventionist sense of causality. But rather that such and such a conception of causality is presupposed. So he says, the metaphysician's business is not to propound them, absolute presuppositions, but to propound the proposition that this or that one of them is being presupposed. So the metaphysician says the physicist is presupposing this, the biologist is presupposing this, but he's not saying this is true.
Good. Thanks. That's helpful.
Just a bit of terminology to see if I can understand clearly. So you spoke several times about absolute presuppositions. That would imply, at least in my mind, the existence of relative presuppositions. Does that distinction make sense? And if so, can a relative presupposition turn at some point into an absolute one? Can the converse be true? Those are mine.
Yeah. No, absolutely. So, I have rushed through his conception of metaphysics, and he does make the distinction between absolute and relative presuppositions. And one way, so he thinks that, in a sense, relative presuppositions are the kind of statements that that have a dual role in the logic of question and answer, that they can function both as propositional answers to questions and as presuppositions which give rise to questions. So,
so the propositions.
So there are some statements that what he calls relative presuppositions can have a dual role. Yeah, I'm trying to think of an example now. I suppose that so you could be a doctor, and you might be seeing a patient, yeah, and the patient, and you might, they tell you about certain symptoms that they have, and on the basis of those symptoms, you might presuppose, you might sort of presuppose a particular diagnosis, yeah, and that's a presupposition that you make. But then you can falsify that because you can find that actually it's not what they have, it's something else. But so there are some presuppositions that if there's some statements, so in a way, if you call them presuppositions, you are presupposing them. You're not asserting them as propositions. But there are some statements that can be either. What it does say is that relative presuppositions are different from absolute presuppositions. And I think, if you try and spell out why is it that he thinks that absolute presuppositions never have truth value, so they never answer the question, I think that the reason why he thinks that is because he thinks of them as methods of discovery in a way in which, relative presuppositions are not really method of discovery. They are fundamental assumptions, they're important assumptions that are made within a method of discovery. So you might have arrived to the hypothesis that that the sun revolves around the Earth, and that might be a kind of the end of a very lengthy investigation, which you've proved, and that you're presupposing then from then. But that is not so that could be something that was relatively presupposed by pre-Copernicans, yeah, and which has been henceforth found to be false, yeah. So when we find it to be false, we falsify it, we treat it as a proposition, yeah. But the ways in which you go about falsifying absolute presuppositions tell you how some of the fundamental assumptions that you need in order to go about verifying and falsifying them. So in that sense, they are different from relative presuppositions. So you, okay. I don't think that Collingwood believes that you could, no matter how much progress you make within a form of inquiry, that could lead you to reject the fundamental assumptions that govern that form of inquiry. So, for example, let's say, everybody now presupposes that the Egyptians buried their dead because they believed in the afterlife, and it was very important to them, and they built the pyramids because of that. Yeah, we could, and that is something that now we presuppose. Yeah, but we could find out that that was false. It's conceivable that one day, that will be found out to be false. Yeah, but what you cannot falsify, according to Collingwood, no matter how much your humanistic knowledge of the Egyptians progresses, of the ancient Egyptian progresses, is to find out what they believed by assuming that they had reasons to believe something. Because that people have reasons for believing, reasons for acting, is in a way belongs to, is more like a method of discovery than something which is very widespread. Yeah. So I think that he didn't really think that you can ever overthrow these fundamental presuppositions through the growth of knowledge internal to that presupposition.
So they're kind of there for, how to say this, all the time, no matter what happens in every possible world, those absent positions will hold?
Well, I think that to say that they are constitutive is not the same as saying that they are timeless. So that, if we die, nobody, there will be no doctors, and there'll be no practice of medicine, and maybe there might have been a time when, we can imagine perhaps people not making the distinction between humanistic and scientific explanations, but that is not to say that if you are going to talk to somebody as an action, you have to have the presupposition. So I think that to say that they are constitutive doesn't mean that they will always exist, that they always existed. But I think sometimes people think that is to say that they're universal in somewhat Kantian sense. But I think there is depending on how one read Kant, but some people think that there is a sort of stronger notion of constitutiveness, which comes from Kant, where you say if something is constitutive, then it's necessary and universal. I don't think that's what he means. I think he means that if you have that way of thinking, of knowing, then it will always be true in a sense, even if there were no people to practice it. But it's not that kind of time-bound claim in a way.
Thank you. If I may interject, because I have a follow-up on that. So, as I understand, then the absolute presupposition that you're talking of are more or less functionally the same as the categories of Kant, but not in a universal way. And when you talk about presupposition analysis as the logical constructions of presupposition from the answers of questions, it seemed to me very similar to the transcendental arguments of Strawson in a way, but the transcendental argument of Strawson end up with metaphysical conclusion. So I was wondering if this absolute presupposition, even if they are not supposed to be truth evaluated, they have some metaphysical content in the system of Collingwood. Is easier, because one of the issues with the transcendental argument for Strawson is that he is rejecting the transcendental idealism of Kant. What he called the case of transcendental psychology, and he believes that transcendental argument enables you to have true value but metaphysical world as it exists. That's the issue. But for Collingwood, doesn't seem to be like that. But at the same time, he's not either also a constructivist, as you said yesterday. So, what is the what is, if there is one, the metaphysical content of these propositions?
So you're thinking of the debate between Strawson and what's the other philosopher? And Stroud.
Yes.
That's right. And Stroud, I think, quite rightly says that you cannot draw metaphysical conclusion from epistemic premises.
Well, at least if you're not buying the transcendental idealism.
Yeah, by means of transcendental argument. And I think he is right in a way that, so that if you say, okay, space is the condition of the possibility for making a distinction between the inner and inner and outer appearances, but that doesn't mean the space exists. So you're not drawing, I think the transcendental arguments don't allow you to make metaphysical conclusions, and I think that people overreach when they think that they can make those ontological conclusions. I don't think that Collingwood is trying to overreach. Otherwise, he would have to say that they're true. He denies that they have true or false values. I think he would have to say that it is true that this proposition apply within this form of inquiry, but he doesn't think that that's the right way of putting it. It's the right way of putting it is that you cannot engage in that form of, you cannot consistently engage in that form of inquiry. So, so it's quite different from Hume, because Hume is saying, oh yeah, you can live the schizophrenic life, so you can separate your life as a philosopher, what you think when you are in the philosophical study, and what you believe when you go out of the philosophical study. So in the philosophical study, you're a skeptic. Outside the philosophical study, you believe in your inductive generalizations and everything. And he says, no, that's a kind of, if you want to sort of divide these two selves, if you want to reunite these two selves, then you have to accept that when you are outside of the philosophical study, you have to accept those presuppositions as something that you are, using in gathering knowledge.
Which if you are some kind of transcendental idealist at some point, like Kant, then the fact that you have to take them, I don't want to say to be true, but in a way you are forced to, when you practice, you are forced to be, if you want to be coherent, to take them to be beliefs and not just presuppositions. So in this way, when you are practicing something with a presupposition that you need to do practice, it have some kind of metaphysical content, even if it's not metaphysics in the sense that it tells you truths about the world in itself, but it tells you something about the way you are forced to see the world to practice your craft.
In that sense, I think that absolute presuppositions are a little bit different from Kantian postulates. Because Kantian postulates are things that you have to assume to be true, but that you cannot find out or know to be true. Yeah. So I think that Collingwood, in that sense, goes beyond Kant, because what he is saying is that it's not that there is a kind of knowledge that we cannot have, but nonetheless we have got to make certain assumptions. We have to treat certain assumptions as true in order to say certain things. I think what he is taking a step further, and he's saying it really makes no sense to speak of this, these postulates, if you like, as if they were true or false, because they are so necessarily needed in order to make the claims that we make that you cannot genuinely doubt them. The doubt is not genuine. Yeah. So I don't think they're quite. I think that I did treat them myself as Kantian postulate at some point, but I think he goes beyond that, because there is a difference between saying presuppositionless knowledge exists and we cannot have it, and to say presuppositionless knowledge is not actually a kind of knowledge. And I think that's what he's saying.
Okay. That's much clearer, thanks. Other questions? Okay, Daniel?
Thank you for the talk. You mentioned at a certain point, if I'm not wrong, the idea that the idea of a metaphysics without ontology, right? Do you think that in a perspective on metaphysics like the one offered by Collingwood, ontology may come back as a part of the context in which we explore, I don't know, causality or what else, as the peculiar form of being that appear in that specific context? Yeah,
I think if you think of ontology in that way, yes. So you could say, I mean, I am reluctant to say that. I think you used the expression yesterday, and I would, I was almost say I agree, but I would be reluctant. You said ontological questions come before epistemological questions for Collingwood, and in some ways I could say yes. Let's talk like that, because provided that you understand ontology in a particular way, provided that by ontology you mean the subject matter, which is to say being already disclosed qua action or qua this or that, so once if you understand ontology in that way, then I would be saying yes, then ontological questions come before for Collingwood, come before epistemological questions, because in a way you have to adjust your method of inquiry to the kind of thing that you are investigating. It's a little bit like when Locke speaks about criteria for personal identity and says, look, there isn't just one single criterion of identity. You have, the criterion of identity that you apply, you have to match it to the kind of thing that you're talking about. But in Collingwood's case, the kind of thing that you're talking about is a correlative of a particular form of explanation. It's not an ontology in the sense in which it's normally possibly understood. I don't think that, normally metaphysicians don't, when they speak about ontological questions, I don't think that they mean to talk about reality already disclosed under certain descriptions. So if one takes the sort of more robust sense of ontology, I would say no, but if one uses, I think, as you've used it, then yes. And in a way, it would be nice to be able to speak that way. It's just that you can't, because if you do, then people misunderstand you.
Okay. Thank you.
Other questions? Baudouin? No questions? Well, I still have one. I can go on. We still have 12 minutes, so we have time if you have last minute.
Yeah, that's right. It's value for money, isn't it?
It's okay. So there was at some point you were using the example of the bottle of water to make the difference between scientific history and humanistic history, and saying that the bottle of water would be freezing at zero temperature even if you take it back to 2,000 years ago. And I was wondering if it means that for Collingwood, scientific history is necessarily inductive in a way, because you said we presuppose that the nature is uniform, and so usually the infinity of nature is a way to vindicate the principle of induction, and so that's the kind of presupposition you use for using induction. So I'm wondering if Collingwood takes science to be like necessarily inductive, or if there's other ways to science.
I mean, in a way, he's speaking at a very, very broad level, and he is saying that. I know that there are people today who deny that. Yeah. But I think there are not just Latour, because I mean, in a way, Latour. I think there are sort of hard, much more sort of realists who deny that. I don't think he's necessarily saying that. I think that these presuppositions are, in some ways, they don't define the methods of physics, of biology, or geology. Or, they are too broad, you know.
Yeah, but in
but
history, sorry.
Yeah, but in some ways they're saying if you're doing science in a way, you're looking for certain kind of, you know, patterns and regularities or in processes that can, and that is a kind of fundamental assumption that governs it. But I don't think that necessarily commits it to the claim that it's just inductivist. I don't think it does. But it's a good question. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't have an answer.
Yeah.
But just that the example to me it looks a lot like also the Latour counter-example to be against this kind of I say that historical transportation or something of concepts, talking about zero temperature at the time of Egyptian doesn't make any sense. In the same way that the bacillus of what's the name again of the disease that
the bacillus, yeah. I think that Collingwood would disagree with that. So he would say that you have to be careful about what you're doing, whether you're doing science or the history of science. So if you're doing science, then you can say that Pharaoh Ramses II died of tuberculosis, and the Egyptians were wrong. They just didn't know about that. But if you're doing the history of science, then you cannot ascribe to the Egyptians the beliefs that the tubercle bacillus exists. So I think he would disagree with Latour in that respect. He would say that there is a difference between science and the history of science. And in that sense, you know, if you're doing the history of science, you can say that Pharaoh Ramses II died of tuberculosis precisely because the bacilli behave in the same ways, both at the time of the ancient Egyptians and now.
Which presupposes scientific realism in a way.
No, it presupposes that you are looking at nature as uniform. So I think there is a distinction between presupposing that nature is uniform and asserting that as a proposition. Yeah? So, and in a way, he does want to make it, so he doesn't want to collapse science into history. He doesn't want to do that, which is what Latour is doing. He doesn't want to do that. Because otherwise he would be guilty, you know, the discussion that we had yesterday, of a form of inverted scientism. Yeah. So he doesn't want to say that science is historical, is a humanistic discipline. He doesn't want to say that. He's saying it's a different kind of knowledge with different presuppositions. Yeah. So he would disagree with Latour about, you know, he would say, well, it depends. You know, if you are doing history of science, then you would be anachronistic, okay, to ascribe to the Egyptians this belief. But if you're doing science, it's different. you can just refute what they said. They were wrong. Yeah.
I see the point.
Can I ask you a very broad question about how does Collingwood applies his logic of question and answer to works of art? I ask that because I just read his autobiography and the passage when he talks about the Albert Memorial and how is it very ugly, but anyway. But I haven't read his other works on the philosophy of art, so I would like to know more about that.
Yeah, I mean, his principles of art are quite a sort of tricky text in many ways. And I think that they are quite underexplored, actually, partly because, again, when people read them, they don't really try to locate what Collingwood is doing in terms of the kind of questions that are asked within the philosophy of art. I think that one of the things that sort of relates, that clearly relates in terms of how he, some of the things that he says in the principles of art to what he's doing in the national metaphysics, is this idea of bringing, you know, of disentangling concepts. So, you know, the Greeks didn't clearly distinguish between fine art and techne, you know, so they thought of art as a kind of craft. And so I think in Plato, kind of, you know, you mentioned musicians, poets, and cobblers, you know, because that's how they were viewed. And he wants to make that distinction between art and craft. And in a way, that's a kind of disentangling of the concept of art along the lines of, say, the disentangling of the concept of cause or disentangling of the concept of the past. So art and craft are different concepts. So one could sort of use, I think, some of the resources of the Essen metaphysics or the Essen philosophical method in terms of his idea of the overlap of classes, for example, in order to show that, you know, you can bring reality under different descriptions. So you can have a beautiful vase, yeah, like a German Scheurig vase from the 1970s or whatever, and say, well, on the one hand, it's a craft because it's, you know, it's an object that has been created with a particular use in mind. But on the other hand, it's kind of a beautiful thing. So I think that one could bring what Collingwood is doing to bear upon his philosophy of art. And I don't think it's been, I mean, there is a certain amount of work on it, but I'm not sure it has been done fully.
Could you point to some articles or chapters of books maybe?
Well, so the principles, in terms of his work, the principles of art, especially the opening, the beginning, I think it's book 1. You know, I think somebody who is a sensitive reader, but doesn't, you know, is Aaron Ridley. So I think he sort of reads him. I think he sees through the accusations of idealism that are made against him. So I think he, you know, but it doesn't. I don't think it doesn't bring. I don't know of anybody who really does do that. But I know that I would say that Aaron Ridley is I think is not caricaturizing some of his idealistic claims. You know, and that's, I think, he's a sensitive reader of some aspects of the principles of art. But it hasn't been done properly. So that would mean bringing the metaphilosophy to bring, you know, just as I've done it to the philosophy of history, it would mean to bring Collingwood's metaphilosophy to bear upon his philosophy of art. And his criticism of, you know, I suppose the failure to distinguish between, you know, his criticism of the technical conception of art.
If there is a very last short question, or if there is some question online, maybe?
No.
No?
There have been a lot of people online,
Wow.
but they have not asked questions.
No last minute question then. All right. Well, let me join again in thanking our speaker.